Good evening and welcome to episode 109 of Mystery, Murder, and Mayhem. Hopefully, you're having a good week. Now, we're finally having a bit of drier weather here in South Carolina, and the temperatures are definitely getting closer to normal for this time of year. And I can't say that I'm enjoying it because I am not a fan of the heat, so I stay indoors a lot during the summer months. And by normal temperatures, I mean that the heat index is pushing 100 degrees most days. Lots of indoor activities for us this summer. Well, tonight's episode took place back in 1945 in West Virginia. It tells the story of a family's house fire and the sad consequences related to it. For nearly 40 years, a billboard stood on Route 16 in Fayetteville, West Virginia. That billboard bore the photographs of five children who had gone missing on Christmas Eve in 1945. Those five children were 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Lewis, 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty. And over the years since then, a lot of speculation has circulated about what actually happened that night. The five missing children were members of the Sodder family. Their father, George, had been born in Sardinia in 1895, and he immigrated to the U.S. at the age of just 13 years old. An older brother had came with him to America, but once they reached Ellis Island, he immediately went back to Italy and left his younger brother there all alone. Now, before settling in West Virginia, George found work along the way in Pennsylvania working on the railroads. And once he reached the town of Smithers, West Virginia, he found work as a driver. But it wouldn't be long before he started his own trucking company. It seems that George was smart and pretty resourceful. And he would meet his wife, Jenny Cipriani, when he walked into a local store called the Music Box. And Jenny was the owner's daughter, and she had came to America from Italy at the age of 3. Now, soon the two were married, and they would start a family. Between 1923 and 1943, they had 10 kids, and sometime around that time, the family would move to Fayetteville, West Virginia. Fayetteville was a small Appalachian town with a very active Italian immigrant community. And according to the locals, the Sodders were one of the most respected families in town. So let's talk about that fire. Around 12:30 a.m., everyone had went to bed after opening a couple of their Christmas gifts. Sometime shortly afterwards, the phone rang, and it was answered by Mrs. Sodder. The unfamiliar voice on the other end asked for someone who didn't live there, so Miss Sodder informed her that she had the wrong number. She hung up the phone and she started making her way back to bed, but she noticed on her way back to bed that all the lights were on downstairs, and the curtains were open, and the front door was unlocked. And she noticed that one of their kids, Marion, was asleep on the couch and assumed that the rest of the kids were asleep upstairs. So she turned the lights off, closed the curtains, locked the door, and went back to bed. And she had just started to doze off when she heard the sound of something hitting the roof. It was like a loud thud, and then it rolled off of the roof. Kind of weird, right? After that, she did manage to go back to sleep, but only an hour later, she was woken again by heavy smoke drifting into her room. She and her husband George and 4 of the kids had managed to escape the house, but of course, the Sodders were panic stricken and began trying to rescue the remaining kids from the burning home. Now, George tried saving the kids by busting a window to re enter the house, and in the process of doing that, he cut a large slice out of his arm. Now, unfortunately, he was unable to see anything once he got in because of the smoke and fire which had overtaken most of their large home. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty had to still be hiding in their bedrooms, or at least that's what they figured was going on. And the problem, though, was that the two bedrooms that George figured that they had to still be in were on opposite ends of the hallway upstairs, and the staircase that was engulfed in flames was separating the two bedrooms. Well, after he figured that he would never make it up those stairs to save them, he raced outside, hoping that he could reach the bedrooms from the outside, and he had planned on using a ladder that he kept propped up against the house, but get this, y'all, it was missing. So then he had the idea to drive one of his trucks up to the house, but in another, get this moment, none of the trucks would start, and they had functioned perfectly the day before. While all of this was going on, their daughter Marion ran to a nearby neighbor's house to call for the fire department, but she couldn't get an operator to respond. And you got to remember, these were the days long before 911 or actually even dialing the number that you wanted to call. If you watch shows like The Andy Griffith Show, you've seen them tell Sarah who they needed to call. Well, sadly, there was no Sarah or any other operator to connect the call that night. But fortunately, that neighbor volunteered to drive into town and notify the fire chief of the fire at the cider place. And it would take a while to get the other members of the fire department together, though, because they used a phone tree system. And it was finally around 8 a.m. that morning when they arrived at the home, and that was about 6 hours after the fire had started. The house had been reduced by then to just a pile of smoldering ashes. Now, Jenny and George could only assume that their children were dead, but after a brief search of the property on Christmas Day, no remains were found. Chief Morris from the fire department told the family that the fire hadn't been hot enough to completely burn the bodies. And if they had died in the fire, something like bones or other remains would have been found. And after the state police inspector checked out the property, he attributed the fire to faulty wiring. And just before the new year, the coroner's office issued death certificates citing the deaths were caused by either fire or suffocation. But the Siders weren't accepting that their 5 missing children had died in that fire. Now, it wouldn't be long before the family started stitching together odd memories of these little things that had happened just before the fire. Just a few months before that devastating fire, a stranger showed up at their front door, and he was asking about hauling work, because that's the type of trucking that George, or the business that he owned. So as he talked to George, he somehow made his way around to the back of the house and stopped there where he pointed at the 2 fuse boxes and said, "This is going to cause a fire someday." Well, of course, George thought that was strange for him to say, especially since he had just recently had somebody come out from the power company and inspect those fuse boxes. And by the way, the power company found nothing wrong with those fuse boxes, so that was just strange. And around that same time, another man had came by trying to sell the family life insurance. And when George declined to buy any from the man became irate and warned them that, quote, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed. You're going to be paid for the dirty remarks that you have been making about Mussolini." And that's the end of that quote. Now, it was very well known around town that George was quite outspoken about his negative feelings of Mussolini, and sometimes those opinions would land him in heated arguments with other members of the town's Italian community. But he just didn't take the man's threats seriously at the time. And one of the older sons mentioned to his parents that just before Christmas, he had seen a man parked along US Highway 21, and he was watching the younger kids as they came home from school. It's starting to sound like something more than just wiring causing the fire, isn't it? Well, Jeannie decided to do some investigating of her own. She just couldn't believe that 5 of her children had died in the fire and no bones or flesh were left behind. In an experiment, she gathered some animal bones, like chicken bones, beef joints, and pork chop bones, and she set them on fire to see if the fire would consume them. Each time she was left with charred bones. Well, she consulted an employee at a crematorium and they told her that even after cremating a body for 2 hours at 2,000 degrees, bones were still left after everything else was gone. And it had only taken about 45 minutes for their home to burn completely. But the odd events don't end there. A phone repairman told the family that their phone lines had been cut, not burned. Who would do such a thing? And then later, a witness came forward saying that he had seen a man at the scene of the fire with a block and tackle, which is used to remove engines from vehicles. Could this be the reason those trucks wouldn't start? And then one day, while they were visiting the property, the youngest daughter, Sylvia, found a hard rubber object laying on the ground. And that's when Jenny remembered hearing the thud on the roof. After inspecting it, George concluded that the rubber object that Sylvia had found was a napalm pineapple bomb that was like what they used to use in warfare. Well, soon reports started coming of sightings of the children. One woman claimed to have seen them looking out the window of a passing car during the fire. And another woman who worked at a tourist spot between Fayetteville and Charleston, West Virginia, said that she saw the kids the morning after the fire. She told the police that she served them breakfast and they had arrived in a car that had Florida license plates. There was 2 women and 2 men with them, and they registered at the hotel and stayed in one of the larger rooms with multiple beds. And when the woman tried to talk to the kids, the men became angry and wouldn't let her speak with the children. And that just sounds pretty sus, right? They left the hotel very early the following morning. Nearly 2 years after the fire, the Sodders received a letter, or they sent a letter. I'm sorry about that. They sent a letter to the FBI pleading for their help, and they received a reply from J. Edgar Hoover. And that reply stated that they would like to help, but it fell under local jurisdiction. But they would be happy to help if the local agencies needed help. Now, the local police and fire departments both declined the FBI's offer. So from there, the Sodders hired a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley. Tinsley found that the insurance salesman that had threatened George was also a member of the coroner's jury that had decided that the fire was accidental. A Fayetteville minister also told Tinsley that Fire Chief F.J. Morris had found a human heart in the ashes, although he had claimed to find no remains. And he claims that he hid it in a dynamite box and buried it at the scene. So Tinsley went to talk to Morris, and he persuaded him to show him where that heart was buried. They dug up the box and took it to a local funeral director, who, after some testing, decided that it wasn't a human heart, but it was a beef liver. Soon the Sodders were hearing rumors that Morris had told others that he hadn't found what he had put in the box at the scene of the fire at all, and that he had buried the beef liver in the rubble from the fire in hopes that the Sodders found, like if they found any remains, he was hoping that they would just call off the investigation, like it would just satisfy them. Well, for years after that, tips kept coming in. And George saw a newspaper picture of some school children in New York City, and he was convinced that one of them was his daughter, Betty. And he even drove all the way to Manhattan to find the child, but her parents refused to speak to him. Then in the summer of 1949, the Sodders decided to start a new investigation, and this time they brought in a Washington, D.C. pathologist named Oscar B. Hunter. Now, a very thorough excavation of the property was conducted, and in the process, they uncovered 3 small objects. One was a damaged coin, the second was a partially burned dictionary, and the last was several pieces of a vertebrae. Hunter sent those pieces into the Smithsonian Institution, and what they found was that the vertebrae was human and that it had belonged to someone who would have been 16 or 17 at their death. Now, the oldest missing child was 14 years old, and it was possible that it was a 14-year-old's vertebrae, but not probable. Plus, there was no proof that the vertebrae had been exposed to fire, and no other bones were found. So basically, there were still no answers. Well, because of that report from the Smithsonian, two hearings were held in Charleston, West Virginia. And after those hearings, Governor Oki L. Patterson and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett told deciders that the search was hopeless and the case was closed. Now, can you imagine being the parent and hearing that your search for your children is hopeless? I mean, maybe at that point it was, but how could you bring yourself to say something so callous to these grieving parents that needed answers? But George and Jenny weren't put off by this, and this is when the billboard with the children's pictures were put up, and they began handing out flyers. They were offering a $5,000 reward for information that led to the recovery of their children, and not long after that, they bumped up the amount for the reward to $10,000. And then they received a letter. And that letter was from a woman in St. Louis, and she was saying that her daughter Martha was in a convent there. Then another tip came from Texas, and it seems that a patron in a bar there overheard a conversation about a fire that took place on Christmas Eve some years ago in West Virginia. Then someone from Florida said that the children were staying with a distant relative of Jenny's. Well, George traveled all over the country following up on all these leads, but sadly, he came home empty-handed each time. So, fast forward to 1968. Jenny goes out to check the mail, and she finds that she has a letter addressed to only her. The postmark was from Kentucky, but there was no return address. And when she opened the envelope, she found a photograph of a young man in his mid-20s. And on the back of the photo, a note was written that said, "Lewis Sauter, I love brother Frankie." Now, she nor George could deny that there was a striking resemblance to their Lewis, who had been 9 at the time of the fire. And there was just too many similarities to ignore, so once again, they hired a private investigator and they sent him to Kentucky. But they would never hear from that investigator again. Now, the following year, George passed away, not knowing if his kids were out there somewhere or if they had truly perished in the house fire. And Jeannie, who had been wearing black in mourning for her children, was now mourning the loss of her husband, too. And she had a tall privacy fence built all the way around the house, and then she started adding more and more rooms to the house. And she was trying to shut herself away from the outside world, and she continued to have rooms built until her own death in 1989. Well, after her death, the billboard eventually came down, and then her remaining children and grandchildren started investigating on their own. And along the way, they came up with their own theories about the case. One of the theories was that the mafia had tried to recruit their father, and he had declined. Maybe the mafia had tried to con money out of them, and he refused to give in. Or maybe someone that they knew had kidnapped the kids. Maybe if the kids had gotten kidnapped and they were still alive, they had never tried to contact their parents because they were trying to protect their parents. And the last of the known surviving children, Sylvia, she passed away in 2021. And she had made it known on many occasions that she never believed that her siblings died in that fire. And I have to say that I agree with Sylvia. It seems to me that if they had perished in the fire, there would be bones left, but there wasn't. And I have no idea what actually happened to the children, but I don't believe that they died. And it's just odd that someone can disappear off the face of the earth, and all of these years later, we're no closer to knowing what happened to them than when it first happened. Well, y'all, that's all I have for tonight's episode. Be sure to check out the links in the episode description, and y'all have a good night.
Listen, I'm not going to tell you about a product unless it's something I love and I use it on a daily basis. And what I'm about to tell you about is one of those. Over the years, I packed on quite a few pounds from having babies, stress, eating for comfort, and now as a 51-year-old woman, hormones are not on my side at all. Now, I had been seeing people on social media talking about Obvi. They were talking about how much weight they've lost and how they feel so much better. They had nothing but good things to say about it. Of course, I was skeptical, but you know what? I gave in and I gave it a try. And boy, am I glad that I did. Over the past 5 weeks since I started using it, I've lost 22 pounds. I haven't tried every single product that they have, but I have to say my favorite is the Collagenic Burn. 2 capsules at breakfast, another 2 at lunch, and I have energy for the entire day. And it's not that jittery energy and there's no crash when it's done doing its magic. And you experience that with a lot of products out there. Plus, my hair and nails are growing like crazy and my achy joints feel better each day. Your results may not be exactly the same as mine, but I encourage you to give it a try. Now, all you have to do is click the link in the episode description for my Avi, and then you can save 15% by using the promo code Mystery M.